morning, my name is Mark Lea-Wilson. From the 1500s to the 1800s, the British Empire relied heavily upon this transatlantic slave trade to provide itself with luxury items such as sugar, rice, and tobacco. The transatlantic slave trade was also known as the Triangle of Trade. The Triangle of Trade occurred as British ships first sailed down from Britain down to Africa, and there they would trade over European goods for Africans. The Africans would then be forced onto the ships, and the British ships would then sail, making the second part of the triangle over to the Caribbean and to the North America. There in North America and in the Caribbean, the Africans would be traded over for the luxury items. And then finishing the last leg of the Triangle of Trade, the geographical triangle, they would finish by sailing back up to Britain and then returning with the luxury items. William Wilberforce was the first one to confront Parliament or the British government about the slave trade in his 1789 speech. His 1789 speech was the beginning of a long war between supporters of the Abolition and supporters of the slave trade. We will now observe William Wilberforce himself, the great warrior of the Abolition. When I refer to the Abolition, I refer to a movement in the 1700s and 1800s, a movement to end or abolish the slave trade, or just slavery in general. And those who supported the abolishment of slavery were called abolitionists, and William Wilberforce was an abolitionist. He was born into a rich family in Hull, England, and in 1784 he became an MP, or a Member of Parliament. A Member of Parliament is similar to a representative in America, in that he simply represented the voice of people in England in the British government called Parliament. He was best known for his eloquence. As the Bishop of London states in a letter that he wrote on May 13, 1789, "It is with heartfelt satisfaction I acquaint you that Mr. Wilberforce yesterday opened the subject, the slave trade, in the House of Commons in the ablest and most eloquent speeches that was ever heard in or any other place." So as you can see, the Bishop of London and other people greatly appreciated his eloquence. Now, let's take a look at the gruesome aspects of the slave trade that made Wilberforce give his speech in Parliament. As I mentioned briefly in the introduction, the slave trade was a terrible crime, a national crime that Britain committed. The Middle Passage, which was the second part of the triangle from Africa over to the Caribbean, was a terrible journey. This journey was around 3 to 12 weeks, forced on all Africans that were brought to the Caribbean and North America. As Africans were forced in chains to go down below deck on the British ships, they had individual spaces. These individual spaces were around 6 feet long and 16 inches wide. Imagine only having around 16 inches wide of space to lie down in for whole weeks. Down below deck, conditions were absolutely terrible. As quoted by Thomas Lewis in Encyclopedia Britannica, oxygen levels were so low that candles couldn't even burn. This is how bad conditions were. Ventilation was terrible. There were fevers, there was oppressive heat, dysentery. It was very hard to survive. So hard that around 13% of all Africans brought across died just during the travel across. In all, millions of slaves and Africans were brought across and forced to take this horrific journey across the Atlantic Ocean. Since we've seen how the Africans and slaves were treated, I will now tell you how Wilberforce challenged Parliament in his abolition speech. Wilberforce was long-winded. As seen in an article written by the Wall Street Journal, written by Bill Coles says his speech was 4 hours long. 4 hours? What would you put in a speech 4 hours long? Well, in his speech he collected lots of data and lots of facts to hopefully convince Parliament that the slave trade went against what they believed, went against the values that they valued. In his introduction, in his abolition speech, Wilberforce boldly claims on May 12, 1789, "We are all guilty. We ought all to plead guilty, and not to exculpate ourselves by throwing the blame on others." Wilberforce understood that the guilt of the slave trade did not simply fall on one man's shoulders. Everyone had benefited from it, therefore every man was guilty of it. Wilberforce claimed that the slave trade contradicted their own beliefs. In a 1992 thesis by Ann Zack for Oregon State University in Oregon, Zack states, Wilberforce utilized refutative ironies to prove that the slave trade was at odds with their accepted norms of liberty and happiness and benevolence. Wilberforce showed again and again that they were only stealing and pulling away the values that the British themselves valued. They were pulling away the liberties that they had from the Africans. Now that we understand the speech that he gave, we will now look at the results of the speech. Immediately after the speech, there are members of Parliament who stood up and said, "Wilberforce, your facts are false. They are crooked. They're twisted." They claimed that all of his facts, which he had built up and collected for 2 years, were false. Others claimed that the abolition of the slave trade would cripple the British economy. Still, probably the most common argument was that he simply needed more evidence. They could only be convinced if he found more evidence that the slave trade needed to be ended. Wilberforce knew that the slave trade would only go down with a fight. Year after year, he would give speeches, anti-slavery speeches, to try to convince them to end the slave trade. It took 18 years until he finally saw the year of victory. After 18 years of giving speeches and fighting against the evilness of the slave trade, in 1807 he saw the abolition of the slave trade. Finally, he was not outvoted. Finally, he had won. Now, no slaves could be transported. Now, no slaves could be bought. It had completely ended. Now, let's consider what we've learned and review some main points about Wilberforce and his speech. Wilberforce became a member of Parliament in 1784. From his influential position as a member of Parliament, he led the struggle of the slave trade, leading on year after year, giving speeches showing how the slave trade was wrong. He finally won in 1807 when the abolition took place. In conclusion, I will now tell you what occurred after 1807, after the abolition of the slave trade. See, Wilberforce and the other abolitionists didn't just want to end the slave trade, they wanted to end slavery in general, slavery in every place in the British Empire. Slaves could still be owned and mistreated. Therefore, he, again, for 10 years, gave speeches, or this time he was getting too old to give speeches. He was not even a member of Parliament. He could only support those who did. Finally, in 1833, he received news that 800,000 slaves had been set free across the whole British Empire. Wilberforce saw victory, not just for himself, but for all of humanity. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?